Tonight, in the mountains of the Western Balkans, a river turns a turbine. The current it makes runs down a wire, out of the valley, across a border, and into the homes of another country entirely. Bosnia and Herzegovina makes more electricity than it uses. It sells the surplus to its neighbours. On most days of the year, the lights of Croatia, of Montenegro, of Serbia carry a little of Bosnia inside them. And yet, the country sending out that power cannot agree who is in charge of it. It has 3 presidents. Not one after another, 3 at the same time, sharing a single office, taking turns to speak for the state. Above them sits a foreign official that no Bosnian ever voted for, who can strike down their laws and remove them from their jobs. Below them lies a stack of governments so deep that a single pothole in a single street can fall under the authority of 4 separate administrations at once. By almost every measure a country is supposed to be judged by, this one should not function. It has 2 of nearly everything, 13 constitutions, one of the most complicated systems of government on Earth. Foreign observers have spent 30 years calling it broken, unworkable, a state held together with tape. And still, the turbine turns, the power flows out, the trains run on time enough, the pensions are paid, the taps stay wet. Both things are true at the same time. A country that cannot settle the simplest question of who leads it, and a country that has quietly kept itself running for 3 decades while doing so. So, how does it actually work? The answer is not in any one of the 3 presidents. It is in everything underneath them. Start with the shape of it. Bosnia and Herzegovina sits in the heart of the Balkan Peninsula, a country of a little over 3 million people, wrapped almost entirely in mountains and forest. It has one narrow window to the sea, a stretch of coast barely 13 miles wide, and everything else is interior. Ridges, valleys, and fast, cold rivers. At the top of the state stand the 3. One Bosniak, one Croat, one Serb. The 3 peoples the Constitution names as the founders of the country. Each is elected directly by their own community. The Bosniak and the Croat are chosen from one half of the country. The Serb is chosen from the other. Together, they form a single body, a shared head of state, and they are meant to act as one. Every 8 months, the chair passes from one to the next. For 8 months, a Bosniak signs for the country. Then the pen moves to a Croat, then to a Serb. Around and around, 3 times over, across a 4-year term. No single face holds the office for long. No single people is allowed to hold it alone. It was built that way on purpose. And to understand why, you have to understand what it replaced. But hold that thought, because the thing that truly keeps this country alive is not the men at the top. It is the water coming down the mountains and the wire it flows into. Bosnia runs, first of all, on rivers. 5 of them matter most. The Bosna, which gives the northern half its name. The Drina, wide and green, tracing much of the eastern edge. The Neretva, cutting a turquoise line down through the south toward the sea. The Verbas. The Sava, the great, slow border river in the north. And between them, hundreds of smaller streams falling out of the highlands. That falling water is the country's oldest engine. A river dropping through a steep valley carries force, and force can be caught. Bosnia catches it. On the Neretva, on the Drina, on the Verbas sit dams and turbine halls, some of them more than 60 years old, spinning water into current. Grabovica, Salakovac, Yaitsa, where the water has driven machines since the 1950s. These are not famous names. Most people outside the country have never heard them. But together, they carry more than a third of everything the nation's grid delivers. The rest comes from underground. Bosnia sits on coal. Deep seams of it, lignite and brown coal, laid down across the basins around Tuzla and Zenica and Kakanj. Roughly 6 barrels of the country's electricity in 10 are burned out of that coal, in power stations that never fully sleep. Add the rivers to the coal, and the arithmetic comes out in Bosnia's favour. It makes more than it needs. It is one of the few states in the region that is fully sovereign in its own power, beholden to no one to keep its own lights on. Remember that as we go deeper. That the country cannot agree on a flag without an argument, and yet it has never once had to ask a neighbour to keep its lights from going out. But look closer at how that power actually moves, and you find the first great secret of how this country works. The plants that make the electricity are split. Some sit in one half of the country, some sit in the other. There are separate power companies for the Bosniaks, for the Croats, for the Serbs, each generating into its own patch. On paper, 3 utilities drawn along the same 3 ethnic lines as everything else. But the wires that carry the current do not belong to any one of them. The high-voltage grid, the great steel towers marching over the ridges, the transmission lines that actually deliver the power from the plants to the homes, all of it is run by a single national company. One transmission operator, owned jointly by both halves of the country, holding the whole electrical skeleton of the state in its hands. Think about what that means. The 3 peoples cannot agree on a shared history. They keep separate armies of politicians, separate courts, separate schools. But the electricity, the current itself, cannot be divided. A wire does not care which people it serves. And so, at the level of the grid, there is only one Bosnia. There has to be. Somewhere in a control room, a dispatcher watches a wall of screens showing the whole country's load in real time. When a city in the Serb half wakes up and switches on its kettles, demand spikes, and a turbine in the Bosniak half spins a fraction faster to answer it. The power made in one entity flows, second by second, into the homes of the other, whether their politicians are speaking that week or not. The dispatcher balances it all the way through the night. If they get it wrong, the frequency drifts, and the lights flicker in both halves at once. This is the pattern you will see again and again in this country, so watch for it. At the level of argument, everything is split 3 ways. At the level of the machine, of the thing that actually has to work, there is only one system, and every part of it leans on every other part. There is one more thread in the energy story, and it runs the opposite way. Because while Bosnia is master of its own electricity, it is not master of its heat. The gas that warms the homes of Sarajevo in winter arrives through a single pipeline from the east, crossing several other countries before it ever reaches the border. One pipe, one direction. Cut it anywhere along its length, and the capital grows cold, and there is no second line to open. The country that never has to beg for electricity can still, in the depth of January, be held hostage by a single frozen valve 1,000 miles away. But water that makes power is also water that people live beside, and here the machine grinds against them. In the last decade, more than 100 small hydropower plants have been thrown up on Bosnia's mountain streams, each one diverting a river through a pipe to spin a small turbine. To the investors, they were easy money. To the villages downstream, they were the theft of the water itself. In places like Krušika, women stood on the bridges for months, day and night, to block the machines from reaching the river. They called it the fight for the last wild rivers of Europe. Some of the plants were stopped. Some were built anyway. The same falling water that lights the country is now something its own people guard with their bodies, because in a place this steep, whoever controls the stream controls the valley. The water and the wire and the pipe. But the water decided more than the power. It decided where the people are. Look at the country from above and the pattern is plain. The towns sit in the valleys, strung along the rivers like beads on a wet thread. Because in a land this steep, the valley floor is the only flat ground there is. The mountains between them are not decoration, they are walls. For most of history, the ridge over the next valley was a full day's travel, and the people on the far side of it lived a slightly different life, spoke with a slightly different turn, prayed in a slightly different house. 19 empires and kingdoms have passed through this
ground and left their marks stacked one on top of the other.
Rome laid the first roads along the river lines. The medieval Bosnian kingdom rose in the central highlands. Then, for 4 centuries, the Ottomans, who built the bridges and the covered markets and the mosques, and who gave the country its Muslim Bosniak population. Then the Austro-Hungarians, who arrived in 1878 and laid down railways, tram lines, and heavy stone government buildings in the space of 40 years. Each of them settled in the same valleys for the same reason. The water was there. The flat ground was there. And so the map of modern Bosnia, its cities, its roads, its power lines, was drawn not by any parliament, but by the rivers, thousands of years before the first vote was ever cast. Which brings us, at last, into the valley that matters most. Sarajevo. It lies in a long, narrow trough in the mountains, walled by high green slopes on nearly every side, with a small river, the Miljacka, running straight down the middle of it. From the ridges, you can see the whole city at once, laid out below you like something held in 2 cupped hands. The minarets and the church towers and the grey apartment blocks, all pressed into that single crease in the earth. At the eastern end of the old town, the streets are Ottoman, narrow, cobbled, roofed with copper workshops and the domes of 500-year-old mosques. Walk west for 10 minutes and the century changes under your feet. The buildings straighten and rise into heavy Austro-Hungarian stone. Keep walking and you are among the tower blocks of socialist Yugoslavia. A single street, 4 empires deep. There are few places on Earth where you can cross 500 years of history in the time it takes to finish a coffee. Somewhere in that valley stands a building where the 3 presidents keep their offices. And this is where the great question of the country sharpens to a point. Because a shared head of state sounds simple until you ask it to do something. Consider what the 3 are actually meant to do together. They command the armed forces. They conduct foreign policy. They appoint ambassadors. They nominate the man or woman who will chair the Council of Ministers, the closest thing Bosnia has to a national government, which then must be confirmed by a parliament split into 2 chambers, each of which is itself split along the same 3 ethnic lines. And here is the mechanism that governs all of it. The 3 are supposed to reach their decisions together, by consensus. But any one of them can stop the other 2. If a member of the presidency declares that a decision harms the vital national interest of their people, that decision can be blocked. Not delayed, blocked. One hand raised against the other 2, and the machine at the very top of the country comes to a halt. For long stretches, this is exactly what has happened. There have been years when the three could barely agree to meet in the same room. Between 2014 and 2019, the presidency gathered only irregularly, snarled in vetoes, unable to appoint, unable to agree, unable to move. Foreign policy stalled, nominations froze. And still the country did not fall over. The pensions were still paid. The power still flowed out across the border. Which tells you something important, something the whole rest of this story turns on. The three presidents are not the part of the machine that actually keeps the lights on. To feel the division at ground level, leave the capital and go south, down the Neretva, to the city of Mostar. Mostar is beautiful, and Mostar is split. For centuries, its symbol was a single arch of white stone, the Old Bridge, thrown across the Green River by an Ottoman architect more than 400 years ago. It was one of the most famous bridges in the world. In November of 1993, during the war, it was shelled until it fell into the river below. The city watched its own heart drop into the water. It was rebuilt, stone by stone, and reopened in 2004. Divers leap from it into the Neretva again, as they have for generations. But the bridge that once joined the city now spans a line that never fully closed. On one bank, the city is mostly Croat. On the other, mostly Bosniak. And for years, Mostar ran as two cities wearing one name.
2 electricity companies, 2 bus stations, 2 postal systems, 2 football clubs whose supporters do not mix, children taught in separate schools, or in the same building on separate shifts, learning separate versions of the same past. For over a decade, Mostar could not even hold a local election, because the two sides could not agree how to share a single city council. A town of 100,000 people, unable to vote for its own mayor. Mostar is Bosnia in miniature. Everything doubled. Everything shadowed by its mirror image on the far bank. And yet the water still runs under the bridge. And the divers still jump. And the tourists still come. Because underneath the division, the ordinary machinery of a city grinds on regardless. Now widen the lens and see how deep the doubling really goes. Because Mostar's 2 of everything is only the surface of it. Bosnia is not really one country underneath the skin. It is 2. They are called entities. One is the Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina, home mostly to Bosniaks and Croats, covering roughly 51 parts of the country in 100. The other is Republika Srpska, home mostly to Serbs, covering the remaining 49. 2 entities inside one state, each with its own president, its own parliament, its own government, its own police, its own courts. The line between them was drawn to match, more or less, where the front line had frozen when the shooting stopped. And these 2 halves do not share power evenly with the center. It is the other way around. Most of the real authority in Bosnia does not sit at the top with the 3 presidents and the national government. It sits down in the 2 entities. Health, education, policing, most of daily life, these are entity matters. The state at the top is deliberately kept small, holding foreign policy, the currency, defense, and little else. Bosnia is one of the few countries on Earth that was designed, on purpose, to be weak at the center and strong in its halves. Then the halves themselves divide differently, and this is where the true depth of the thing appears. Republika Srpska stayed simple. One entity, centrally run from the city of Banja Luka straight down to the municipalities. But the federation, the Bosniak and Croat half, split itself into 10 cantons. And a canton is not a county. Each of the 10 has its own constitution, its own parliament, its own premier, and its own set of ministries. 10 little governments, each with its own education ministry, its own interior ministry, its own laws, sitting between the entity above and the towns below. So count it now, from the ground up. A citizen in the federation lives under a municipal government. Above that, a cantonal government. Above that, an entity government. Above that, the state. 4 tiers of authority, stacked one on the next, before you even reach the 3 presidents at the summit. Add them all together across the whole country, and Bosnia is governed, at any given moment, by 13 separate constitutions and 1 special statute, and well over 140 ministers. What that means in daily life is friction. Imagine a road that needs repairing where 2 cantons meet. The tarmac on one side answers to 1 cantonal ministry, with its own budget and its own rules. The tarmac on the other side answers to a different one. The bridge between them, if it crosses the entity line, may answer to the state. A single stretch of broken road can require 3 or 4 governments to agree before a single shovel goes into the ground. And any one of them can simply decline. This is the cost of a country built so that no one can dominate. Nothing can be forced through. Which also means nothing can be forced through. The same locks that protect each people from the others also jam the machine when it needs to move. Picture an ordinary man leaving for work in the Federation on an ordinary morning. He wakes in a flat whose building permit was issued by his municipality. He drives on a local road the municipality maintains, onto a main road the canton controls, past a school run by the Cantonal Ministry of Education, none of whose rules match the canton one valley over. His health card is an entity card, honoured here but not automatically across the invisible line. The value-added tax on his morning coffee flows to the state. If he crosses into the other entity to see family after lunch, the police who would answer a call are a different force entirely, under a different command. He has passed through 4 governments before noon and thought about none of them. That is the quiet triumph of the design, and its quiet absurdity. It works precisely because he does not have to understand it. Until, one day, something breaks at the seam, and suddenly he has to ask which of the 4 is meant to fix it. And the cost is not only measured in delay, it is measured in money and in people. Return for a moment to that veto, the vital national interest, because it does not live only at the top. Versions of it run all the way down. In the national parliament, laws can be stopped if a majority of any one people's delegates call them a threat to their interests. In the House of Peoples, the 3 groups sit in fixed, equal blocks. Almost nothing can pass over the firm objection of any one of them. So how does anything pass at all? Slowly, through negotiation, trade, and exhaustion. Consider one number. After the general election of 2010, the parties could not agree on how to form a national government. It took them roughly 14 months. For more than a year, the country had a parliament, but no state cabinet fully in place, running on temporary financing, one of the longest government formations anywhere in the world at the time. A budget that should take a month takes a year. A reform that Brussels asks for waits through election after election. In more than 3 decades, the country has managed to approve a unified state budget on time in only a small fraction of its years. Nowhere is that slowness clearer than on the road the whole country says it wants to travel. Bosnia is a candidate to join the European Union, and Brussels asks candidates to speak with one voice. But a state with 3 presidents and 13 constitutions does not have one voice. It has dozens. So the country had to build a special machine just to answer a single letter, a coordination mechanism that gathers the state, the 2 entities, the 10 cantons, and Brčko into one room to agree on a common reply before it can be sent. A question that another country would answer in a week can take Bosnia months, because every layer must sign off, and any layer can object. And every one of those layers must be staffed 3 ways. Where another country hires one person for a job, Bosnia often hires along the ethnic key, balancing Bosniak, Croat, and Serb, so that no people feels shut out. Multiply that across 4 tiers and more than 140 ministers, and the public payroll swells into one of the heaviest in the region. A vast share of what the country earns goes simply to paying the people who administer its own complexity. The machine's largest single expense is running the machine. And yet, once more, the deep systems held, because those run on a different track entirely, which is the thing we keep circling and are about to reach. But first, the strangest rule of the whole design, the rule about who is allowed to lead. The Constitution names 3 peoples as the founders of the country: Bosniak, Croat, Serb, and it reserves the highest offices for them. To run for the shared presidency or for the House of Peoples, you must declare yourself as one of the 3, which means that if you are none of them, you cannot run at all. 2 men proved it. One is Jakob Finci, a leader of Bosnia's small Jewish community, whose family has lived in Sarajevo for centuries. The other is Dervo Sedic, a prominent figure among the country's Roma. Both are citizens. Both were born there. Both, under the constitution written to end the war, are legally barred from the presidency of their own country, for the single reason that they are neither Bosniak, nor Croat, nor Serb. They took their case to the European Court of Human Rights. In 2009, the court agreed with them. It ruled that Bosnia's own founding document discriminates against its own citizens. The judgment was clear. The remedy was obvious. And more than a decade later, it still has not been fixed. Because to fix it, the 3 peoples would have to agree to loosen their own grip on power, and the machine is built so that none of them ever has to. A country that reserves its highest seats for 3 peoples in a document meant to guarantee equality and cannot bring itself to let anyone else in. Both things are true at once. The design that stopped the war is the same design that keeps some of the country's own citizens standing permanently outside the door. And the doubling does not end with governments and offices. It runs through the ordinary machinery of the state itself. There are in effect 2 railway companies, one for each entity, running trains that must somehow meet at the invisible line. There are separate postal systems. For years there were separate mobile phone networks, each strongest in its own patch, so that a drive across the country could mean your signal quietly changing hands from one people's provider to another. Even the identity documents, the plates, the certificates, once came in competing versions, until they were forced into a single design from outside. The deepest duplication of all is the one built for children. In parts of the Federation, a single school building can hold 2 entirely separate schools inside it, 2 head teachers, two curricula, two sets of pupils, Bosniak and Croat, who enter by different doors, learn from different textbooks, and are taught a different account of the same war, sometimes on different shifts, so they never share a corridor. It is known, plainly, as two schools under one roof. The system does not just divide the adults who lived through the fighting, it reaches down and divides the children who did not, teaching each new generation the line before they are old enough to question it. Of all the machinery in this country, it is the part that most guarantees the machine will still be needed in 20 years. Beneath all of it, though, the country still has to make things and dig things out of the ground. And here the machine is more united than the politics would suggest. In Zenica, in the Central Valley, the great steelworks still glow. The industrial heart the Austro-Hungarians and then the Yugoslavs built, forging steel that ships out to Europe. In Tuzla, in the north, the ground itself is the resource. Tuzla takes its name from the Turkish word for salt. Beneath the city lie some of the richest salt deposits in Europe, and for more than a century, they were pumped up as brine and boiled down. But pull that much material out from under a living city, and the city answers. The ground above the old workings began to sink. Streets buckled, buildings cracked and leaned. Parts of the historic centre subsided so far that they had to be pulled down entirely. Tuzla is a place where you can see, in the tilt of a wall, the exact price of taking too much from the layer directly beneath your feet. That is the country in a single image. Everything is connected to the layer below it. Take too much from one part, and something above it starts to fall. Which brings us back to the invisible line, and to the strangest place on it. You would never find that line by looking. There is no fence, no checkpoint, no change in the color of the fields. You can walk from the Federation into Republika Srpska across an ordinary meadow and never know you have crossed from one government, one police force, one set of laws into another. The line lives on maps and in offices, not on the ground. The same war is remembered in two different tenses, in two different capitals, 30 minutes apart. And at one point on that invisible line sits the strangest arrangement of all. In the north of the country, where the two entities pinch together at their narrowest, lies a small district around the town of Brčko. During the war, it was one of the most fought-over places in Bosnia, because whoever held it controlled the thin neck of land connecting the two lobes of Republika Srpska. Both sides wanted it. Neither could be given it without breaking the balance. So the drafters did something almost without parallel. They gave it to both, and to neither. Brčko today belongs to both entities at once, and is governed by its own local administration, answering directly to the state. It is a condominium, shared property. A single district owned jointly by two governments that agree on almost nothing, run by neither of them, holding the two halves of the country together at the exact point where they are physically thinnest. Pull Brčko out, and Republika Srpska is cut in two. It is a keystone the size of a small town, wedged into the seam, precisely because no one could be trusted to hold it alone. That is the pattern of this whole country, made visible in one place. Nothing here works alone. Remove one part, and something upstream stops. And sometimes, the country is forced to remember that it is one thing, whether it wants to be or not. In May of 2014, after days of relentless rain, the rivers rose. The Sava and its tributaries burst across the north, and the worst floods in more than a century swallowed whole towns. The water did not stop at the invisible line. It did not ask which entity a village belonged to. It drowned Bosniak, Croat, and Serb homes with equal indifference. And on the hillsides, it did something crueler still. It woke old landmines from the last war, tore them loose, and slid them downstream into fields
that had finally been declared safe. Faced with a threat that ignored every border they had drawn, the divided machine did the one thing its politics is built to prevent. It cooperated. Rescue boats crossed the entity line without asking permission. Aid moved between halves that barely spoke to each other. Serbia and Croatia sent help across the outer borders too, old enemies bailing out the same valleys. For a few weeks, the water reminded a country of 3 presidents that it shares a single watershed, a single set of rivers, a single ground. When the flood receded, the divisions returned, as they always do. But the lessons stayed, buried like the mines. Underneath the argument, there was only ever one country, because there was only ever one river. And nowhere is that truer than with the quiet machine that actually pays for all of it. Underneath the 3 presidents, underneath the 2 entities and the 10 cantons and the 13 constitutions, there is one thing every Bosnian shares without ever voting on it: the money. Bosnia has a single currency, the convertible mark, and it is run in a way that leaves almost nothing to argue about. The country operates what is called a currency board. In plain terms, the National Bank cannot simply print money at will. Every mark in circulation must be backed, one for one, by hard foreign reserves held in the vault. The value of the mark is pinned, fixed to the euro, and it does not move. It was set up that way in 1997, deliberately taking the decision out of anyone's hands. It is a rigid, boring machine, and that is exactly why it works. The politicians, for all their vetoes and their walkouts, cannot reach into it. They cannot inflate their way out of a bad year. They cannot debase the shared coin to punish the other half. The currency board takes the one thing that could truly break a fragile country, the money, and locks it in a box that no single people and no single president can open alone. And there is one shared account beneath even that. Nearly all the country's indirect taxes, the value-added tax collected in every shop, the customs charged at every border, flow first into a single national pot. Only then is the money divided out and pushed down through the tiers, to the state, to the entities, to the cantons, to the towns. 4 levels of government, more than 140 ministers, all of them, in the end, drinking from the same well. Follow one truck to see it. A lorry crosses into Bosnia at a northern border post, carrying goods for a shop in Banja Luka. The customs officer who stamps its papers works for a state-level agency, one that serves the whole country. The duty that truck pays does not go to the Serb entity or the Bosniak one. It goes into the shared national pot. And weeks later, a slice of that exact payment comes back out the far side, as the wage of a schoolteacher or the pension of a widow, in a town that officer may never see. One truck, one stamp, and the money threads its way down through 4 governments to land, eventually, in an ordinary kitchen. So when the presidents cannot agree, the well still fills. The customs officer at the border still stamps the truck. The tax still lands in the shared pot. The money still flows down through the layers to pay the teacher, the nurse, the pensioner. The politics at the top can freeze solid, and the circulatory system underneath keeps pumping, because it was built to run without them. But there is one more source that keeps this country
standing, and it is the one the maps never show. Because a great many of the people holding Bosnia up are not in Bosnia at all. Since the war, the country has been bleeding its own people
outward. The young leave. They go to Germany, to Austria, to Slovenia, to anywhere that offers work and a future the layered machine at home cannot. Among the young, joblessness has run close to 1 in 3. A whole generation has grown up packing its bags. There are, by some counts, nearly as many people of Bosnian origin living outside the country as inside it. And they send money back. Every month, from a building site in Munich, from a kitchen in Vienna, from a care home in Ljubljana, a wage crosses the border in the other direction, back to a mother, a village, a family. Added together, these small private streams have amounted, in some years, to as much as 15 parts in every 100 of the entire national economy. More than most foreign investment, more than most aid. Think about what that means. The country is not only held up by the water in its rivers and the coal in its ground and the taxes in its shared pot. It is held up, in large part, by the people who found it unlivable enough to leave and who love it enough to keep sending their wages home. The ones who left are still, quietly, part of the machine, perhaps the largest single part of all. Which is what makes the events of the last 2 years so dangerous. Because for the first time in a long time, someone tried to pull a load-bearing piece out of the wall. The most powerful politician in Republika Srpska, the Serb half of the country, is a man named Milorad Dodik. For years he has argued that the entity he leads should have more independence from the state, sometimes hinting at leaving it altogether. And for years he has said openly that he does not recognize the authority of the foreign official who watches over the peace. That an unelected outsider should not be able to strike down the decisions of an elected assembly. In 2023, he acted on it. The Assembly of Republika Srpska passed laws declaring that the decisions of that foreign official, and even the rulings of Bosnia's own state constitutional court, would no longer apply on its territory. It was, in effect, one half of the country announcing that it would ignore the keystone holding the whole thing together. The response ran the machine at full load. Because defying that office had by then been made a crime, Dodik was charged, tried before the state court, and in 2025, convicted. He was sentenced to a year in prison, later commuted to a fine, and banned from holding the office of entity president for 6 years. In August of that year, the country's Central Election Commission stripped him of the post. For a few weeks, the state held its breath. Would the Serb entity accept the removal of its own elected leader by the institutions of a state many of its politicians barely recognize? At one point, entity police physically blocked state agents from reaching him. The two halves of the country stood for a moment at the edge of the thing everyone had spent 30 years building the machine to prevent. And then, slowly, the mechanism absorbed the shock. Dodik stepped down from the office. A snap election was called to replace him. That vote too was contested, annulled in part, and rerun in the areas where it had gone wrong. It was messy and bitter and unresolved, but the tanks stayed in their sheds. The power kept flowing across the border. The pensions were still paid. The machine strained to its limit and did not break. It bent, and it held. To understand why it could bend that far without snapping, you have to go back to the one thing this documentary will name plainly and then leave behind. Between 1992 and 1995, this country tore itself apart. When Yugoslavia collapsed, Bosnia held a referendum on independence, and the three peoples who shared its ground did not agree on what should follow. What came next was the worst violence Europe had seen since the Second World War. In the town of Srebrenica, in July of 1995, more than 8,000 Bosniak men and boys were separated from their families and killed. It was,
by the ruling of 2 international courts, a genocide. And Sarajevo, this same valley, held below the ridges like something in cupped hands, became a trap. From those high slopes, for nearly 1,400 days, the city was shelled and shot at. It was the longest siege of a capital in modern warfare. People crossed their own streets at a run. More than 100,000 people across the country did not survive the war. Over 2 million were driven from their homes. Let that sit. There is no turn toward comfort here, because there was none. The war ended in the winter of 1995, not with a victory, but with a signature. November 1995. In a heavily guarded airbase in Dayton, Ohio, thousands of miles from the mountains, the 3 sides are brought into the same building and kept there for 3 weeks until they agree. The document they produce does not try to heal the country. It tries only to stop the killing and to build a state that all 3 peoples can live inside without any one of them able to dominate the others. That document is called the Dayton Agreement, and its 4th annex, the part almost no one outside the country ever reads, is the entire constitution of Bosnia and Herzegovina to this day. The country was not founded by its own people writing their own charter in their own language. It was founded by a peace treaty, signed in Paris in December of that year, drafted in English in a foreign country to end a war. Which is why the country you see now is shaped the way it is. The 3 presidents exist so that no single people can rule the other 2. The vetoes exist so that no group can be outvoted on the things it fears most. The 2 entities exist to give each side a home it controls. Every strange feature of this state, every duplication, every lock and counterlock, is an answer to a single question the drafters were asking in 1995. How do you build a country for 3 peoples who have just finished fighting each other in a way that none of them can turn against the others? The answer they reached was to divide almost everything in 2, and then to divide it again, and then to place one more thing above all of it. Meet the part of the machine we have circled all this time, the 4th president, the one no Bosnian ever elected. When the Dayton Agreement built this country, it did not trust the country to run itself straight away. So it created an outside office to watch over the peace. The Office of the High Representative, a single international official appointed by a steering board of 55 governments and organizations, sent to Sarajevo to make sure the agreement held. At first, the office was meant only to advise and coordinate, but within 2 years, when the 3 sides kept refusing to agree on the basics, the international community handed that official something close to absolute power. They are called the Bonn Powers, and they are extraordinary. With them, the High Representative can impose a law that the country's own parliament refuses to pass, and it becomes law. The High Representative can remove an elected official from office, a mayor, a minister, an entity president, and they are gone. The High Representative can overrule the decisions of Bosnia's own institutions. No appeal, no vote. A single foreigner holding a pen that outranks the entire elected state. This foreign official is the reason Bosnia has a flag at all, and a national anthem, and a common currency design, and a single set of license plates that a car can wear across the whole country without betraying which people its owner belongs to. When the 3 sides could not agree on the simplest shared symbols of a shared state, the outside office simply imposed them, so that a nation could have the ordinary furniture of nationhood. And it did something larger than symbols once. In the years after the war, Bosnia had 3 armies, one for each people, the forces that had just fought each other, kept separate and armed inside a single small country. It was the most dangerous arrangement imaginable. And then, in the space of 2 years, in 2005 and 2006, they became one. The three forces were dissolved into a single armed forces of Bosnia and Herzegovina, under a single state command, wearing a single uniform. Men who had shot at each other a decade before now stood in the same ranks. It did not happen because the three peoples woke up trusting one another. It happened because the outside hand pushed hard and would not let go until it was done. It is the clearest proof of what this country can become when the keystone leans on it, and the clearest warning of how much depends on that keystone still being there. So this is the true shape of the machine, complete. 3 elected presidents at the top, who can each stop the other 2. 2 entities beneath them, holding most of the real power. 10 cantons inside one of them. 4 tiers of government, 13 constitutions, a shared currency locked in a box, a shared tax pot feeding all of it, a single grid no one can divide, a diaspora wiring wages home from abroad. And over all of it, a single unelected foreigner with the power to impose laws and dismiss the elected, holding the whole precarious thing in place. For 30 years, that is how Bosnia has worked. Not through agreement, around the absence of it. Which returns us, at the end, to the question we started with, standing in the dark beside that turning turbine. How does a country work with 3 presidents at once? Now you can see the whole answer. It does not work through them. The 3 at the top were never the engine. They are the safety mechanism, the set of interlocking locks that keeps any one people from seizing the others. Locks are not supposed to move quickly. They are supposed to hold. The country runs, instead, on everything beneath them. It runs on the rivers coming down the mountains and the coal beneath the basins, turning the turbines that light the homes and cross the borders. It runs on a single grid that no one can split, where a kettle switched on in one half is answered by a turbine in the other. It runs on a currency locked in a box the politicians cannot open. It runs on a single shared pot of tax that fills whether the presidents meet or not, and flows down through 4 tiers to pay the people who keep the country alive one ordinary day at a time. It runs on the wages of a generation that left, wired home each month across the same borders its power crosses. And it runs, still, on one unelected outsider holding the keystone in the seam, exactly as a small shared district holds the 2 halves together at their narrowest neck. Remove any single one of those parts and trace what happens. Take away the currency board and the shared money becomes a weapon. Take away the shared tax pot and the layers below starve. Take away the single grid and the country that lights its neighbours goes dark in patches. Take away the diaspora's wages and the whole economy sags. Take away the outside keystone and the thing it has been holding, the acceptance that all 3 peoples belong to one state, is suddenly no longer held by anything at all. Nothing here works alone. That is not a weakness someone forgot to fix. It is the entire design. The country was built so that no part could act without the others, precisely so that no part could turn against the others. Its strength and its fragility are the same fact, seen from 2 sides. The very locks that jam the machine are the locks that have kept the peace. The world has spent 30 years calling this place dysfunctional, and by the ordinary meaning of the word, it is. It cannot pass a budget on time. It cannot agree on its own history. It cannot always agree to meet. But dysfunctional is not the same as broken. A machine that has kept the peace among 3 peoples who once fought a genocidal war, that has kept the lights on and the money flowing and the pensions paid for 3 decades, while carrying 13 constitutions and 3 presidents and a foreign referee on its back, is not a machine that failed. It is one of the strangest working machines in Europe. It runs badly, but it runs, and it has never stopped running. Perhaps the people who understand it best are not the ones who call it broken. They are the ones who left it and still send their wages home each month, because they know that a country you can love from a distance is a country that somehow is still there. Every transfer they wire back is a quiet vote that the machine is worth keeping alive. What no one can say is how long the keystone will hold. The Foreign Office was never meant to be permanent. Even now, the 55 governments behind it cannot agree on who should hold it next, or whether it should exist at all. Some want it gone, some want it stronger. The current holder, a German diplomat named Christian Schmidt, may be among the last. And an election is coming, another general vote across the whole country, in which the old questions, who leads, who belongs, who has the right to leave, will all be asked again. The turbine will keep turning through all of it. The power will keep crossing the border. The pensions will be paid. The grid does not vote. But whether the fragile, brilliant, exhausting machine that holds 3 peoples inside one state can go on holding them once the outside hand is finally lifted, no one in Sarajevo or anywhere else yet knows. If you want to keep standing in places like this, in the valleys where the water still draws the map and the systems still hum beneath the surface, stay with us. There are more of them than you would think, and each one works in a way you would never guess from the outside.